A shy, bullied teenager walks onto one of the biggest stages in Britain. Millions are watching. The judges are skeptical. And when he opens his mouth, everything stops. But here's the part nobody talks about. He didn't even win. He lost 2-way. A dancing dog. So how does a story like that end up being one of the most remarkable journeys in modern music? It was March 2012. 17-year-old Jonathan Antoine stepped onto the Britain's Got Talent stage alongside his singing partner Charlotte. Nothing about them screamed star power. They looked like two ordinary kids who had no business being there. Even Simon Cowell wore that familiar look of quiet doubt. And for Jonathan, a boy who had spent years being bullied, isolated, and made to feel invisible, that skepticism must have cut deep. But then he sang, and everything changed. The first note silenced the room. Judges who had been leaning back were suddenly leaning forward. Within seconds, doubt turned to disbelief, and disbelief turned to awe. His voice wasn't just impressive, it was the kind of voice that stops time. By the final note, the crowd was standing. Simon Cowell compared him to Luciano Pavarotti, from being written off before he even started to being measured against one of the greatest singers who ever lived. But here's where it gets strange. Despite the standing ovation, despite going viral overnight, despite the kind of praise most artists never hear in a lifetime, Jonathan didn't win. He came second, beaten by a dog that could dance. It sounds like a joke, but it wasn't. And Jonathan later admitted it hurt, even if he held it together on the outside. So was that the peak of his story? Or just the opening chapter? Losing, it turns out, was the best thing that could have happened. Within days, Simon Cowell signed the duo to a £1 million record deal. Their debut album shot up the charts and reached audiences across the world. Suddenly, Jonathan Antoine wasn't a contestant anymore. He was a name. Tours, TV specials, international press. It all arrived fast, almost too fast, and that's when the cracks began to show. Behind the applause, something was quietly breaking apart. Jonathan and Charlotte had started moving in different directions. He was drawn deeper into classical music. She was pulled toward musical theatre. Neither was wrong, but they were no longer walking the same road. Mix that with the crushing pressure of sudden fame at 17, and something had to give. What happens when two rising stars stop sharing the same dream? In 2014, they found out. The split was announced as mutual, professional, clean, polite. But behind the official statement, two close friends had drifted into silence. The people who had once shared the most electric moment of their lives were now living completely separate ones, and it left a question hanging in the air that nobody could answer yet. Could Jonathan actually do this alone? To understand what came next, you have to go back much further, back before the stages and the record deals, back to a boy who had nothing but his voice and nowhere safe to use it. Jonathan's childhood was defined by isolation. He was bullied relentlessly, targeted for his weight, his appearance, for simply being different. And at that age, that kind of pain doesn't just fade, it settles in. So he did the only thing that helped. He turned to music. Music became the one place where none of that mattered. And then, at 11 years old, a teacher changed everything. She heard something in him that everyone else had missed. Slowly, carefully, his confidence began to grow. By his early teens, he was performing at a high level, winning top scores at music festivals. But emotional scars don't disappear just because life gets better. And those scars, the ones from years of being made to feel less than, those would surface again later when he least expected it. When his first solo album dropped after the split, the world got its answer. It hit #1 on the classical charts, just like that. No partner, no safety net, just his voice, and it was more than enough. Then came an invitation that almost no one receives. Plácido Domingo, one of the most celebrated opera singers in history, personally asked Jonathan to perform with him. That kind of recognition isn't given lightly. It meant Jonathan had arrived at the very top of his field. But success, as it turns out, doesn't heal everything. What they found next, nobody expected. Jonathan began opening up about his struggles with depression. The years of bullying had left, wounds that fame couldn't touch. Even at the height of his career, he was fighting battles that no one could see from the outside. At one point, things became so overwhelming that he had to cancel a major performance, one of the biggest opportunities of his career. Imagine reaching that stage and simply not being able to walk onto it. That's how heavy the weight had become. And it wasn't just the mental toll. A painful personal relationship added more strain to an already fragile period. But through all of it, his family stayed. They held steady when everything else felt like it was falling away. And gradually, Jonathan stopped just surviving and started speaking. He began using his own story to reach others, talking openly about mental health, about bullying, about what it feels like to carry that kind of weight in silence. But there was still one more piece to the puzzle, one revelation that would reframe his entire life. In 2022, Jonathan received an autism diagnosis, and suddenly, so much made sense. The way he had always processed the world differently, the deep, almost spiritual connection to music, the struggles in social situations that had always felt just slightly out of reach to explain. It all clicked. But imagine what that feels like, living your whole life one way, building your identity around experiences you couldn't fully understand, and then receiving a single piece of information that reframes all of it. That's not a small moment. That's a shift in how you see yourself entirely. For Jonathan, it wasn't a limitation, it was clarity. And that clarity moved outward in ways you might not expect. Around the same time, he began taking his physical health seriously. Small habits, done consistently. Daily walks, a different relationship with food. No dramatic overhaul, just steady, quiet progress. Over time, the results were significant. He lost a considerable amount of weight. But more than the physical change, something deeper shifted. For the first time in years, he felt in control. Not performing control, actually feeling it, comfortable in his own body, comfortable in his own story. So where does that leave him now? Jonathan is still creating, still performing, still growing. He may not be splashed across headlines the way he was in 2012, but he never disappeared. He built something real, a career on his own terms, shaped by everything he survived to get there. And maybe that's the actual story here. Not the audition, not losing to a dancing dog, not even the #1 album. It's everything that came after, the quiet persistence, the brutal honesty, the refusal to be defined by the hardest moments. Because when you look at the full picture, there's only one question left worth asking. What matters more? How you start, or how you keep going when everything falls apart?